So this video is going to be about something called irrational time signatures that have a denominator that is not a power of 2. Now, traditionally, you'll have things like 2/4, which takes the same amount of time as 2 quarter notes, or 5/8, which takes the same amount of time as 5/8 notes. But what about this one? This one doesn't make any sense because there's no such thing as a 12th note, so how could you have 8 of them? But check this out. This is a piece of music for big band called Don't Analyze, composed by my friend Brian Kroc. Recently, we sat down and talked about it, and talked about his use of irrational time signatures.
I envisioned this starting off as sort of like a drum beat scenario, where the pocket, like the backbeat was really solid, but all the information between the downbeat and the backbeat is really complex. And so I almost wanted it to sound like part of the measure is getting lobbed off. The first time I saw irrational time signatures like this in a score was in Asila by Thomas Otis, who is a relatively young British composer who's, I think, amazing. I was hesitant to use irrational time signatures because everybody who sees this is like, what the is that? And is really confused, and you have to explain it. Every time signature, the denominator starts from a whole note. And so in a measure of 3/4, you're dividing a whole note into 4 bits, and those happen to be quarter notes. So when you're singing 3/4, you divide the quarter notes, and there's 3 of them. In the irrational time signature, the denominator number is still coming from a whole note. So a measure of 8/12 is divided into 12 bits, and if you divide a whole note into 12, you get 8th note triplets, right? So you would subdivide your 8th note triplets, but there would be 8 of them in a measure of 8/12. I mean, what an irrational time signature really is just a metric modulation, but it's sort of a simpler way to look at it. What I could have done is over every 8/12 measure written a measure of 4/4 and said 8th note triplet equals 8th note right there on the score, But then I'd have to do it every single time. That's a lot of information to look at. And also psychologically, the person interpreting the music would change the reference of the beat. So if it's a metric modulation, all of a sudden you feel this 4/4 at a faster tempo. Right. And I wanted this all to feel continuous. Culmination of this whole piece is in the drum solo. Shout out to Josh Bailey, who's a badass drummer. Who he has to play over this really complicated vamp.
He has to solo over an irrational time signature.
Yeah. The concept is each irrational time signature gets consecutively smaller and smaller. So there's a measure of 8/12, then a measure of 7/12, measure of 5/12, and a measure of 4/12. And so it feels like more and more of those measures are getting chopped off, kind of like a drunk hip-hop beat, So this would sound like, I'll just go through the whole thing. I'll give you a little sing-along finger.
All right.
Okay? I'll ignore I'll just count the rhythm. So it's 1 and 2 and 3 and 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 1 and 2 and 3 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 1 and 2 and
nice.
That's crazy. It's even hard to explain, and
that was great, man.
But it's actually not that complicated, and I think it makes sense as a notation device. And I have a feeling it's going to start to become more common. Like
you kicked off the trend, man. Irrational time signature trend. That's awesome.